Nice.
Thank you for those who join us now. And just few moments, we are waiting for other people to come from the lounge. Inshallah, it will be a wonderful workshop with Professor Donald Ford. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We are very glad today to have our Professor Donald J. Ford, who will be fully introduced by my colleague Irene. He is the man who will make it happen because all of us would like to do webinars and he will help us to make webinar works. Actually, we want from you, if you would like to be more interactive with us, please use the session feed. And also Professor Donald, he will shoot some question to you and you will also be able to respond. If you have any question, please use the Q&A in the session, not in the whole event, but only in the session in order that to be read by the professor. Thank you very much, Professor Donald Ford. You are highly welcome with us. And please, Erin, can you please go ahead?
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. A very good day to all ladies and gentlemen. I'm Irene Lau, your moderator today for this session. Dr. Donald Ford is a training and performance improvement consultant specializing in instructional design, human resources, and process improvement. He has worked in the field of human resource management for over 30 years. Trained and developed over 10,000 professionals and leaders in over 20 countries in North America, Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East. He possesses over 30 years of global experience. He has presented at numerous international conferences, including ARTDO and ARTDO. He has worked extensively overseas in Asia, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. When I had a chat with him the other day, he told me he was one of the first 200 Americans to work and live in China in the 1979s, when diplomatic ties between China and the USA was first concluded. So he is really has widely worked, experienced in Asia. He is the author of Bottom Line Training, Performance-Based Results, the textbook for ITD certified training professional, now in its second edition, and 3 other books on training and education. For the past 1 year, he has been training actively on webinars like this. Therefore, I'm sure you're going to be much enlightened by his sharing today. So fasten our seatbelts and let's welcome Dr. Donald Ford to pilot this session. To you, Dr. Ford.
Well, thank you so much, Irene, for that lovely introduction. I'm not sure I entirely deserve it, but I'll take what I can get. Yes, no, that's very kind of you. And also to Dr. Abdelmageed for his excellent job of hosting today. And welcome to all of you. And as Irene has mentioned, we would like to make this as interactive as we possibly can. So I have posted a couple of questions in the feed and would invite you to respond. And also, as she said, if you would like to ask a question at any time during the presentation, please just click on the session Q&A and post your question, and we will take a look at those as we go along. And I will endeavor to answer them. I will also be stopping a few times throughout the presentation to, again, take any questions that you might have. So hope to make this as interactive as we can for the group of people that have joined us. So again, thank you very much for being here. Let me first of all go ahead and load my presentation at this point. So I'm going to start talking us through the presentation at this point. As you can see, my topic is making webinars work. And I want to share with you some of the best practices for online training that I have personally discovered, as well as what I have read and learned from others. As Irene mentioned, I am a consultant. I own a business called Training Education Management, and I'm located in Torrance, California. That's a suburb of Los Angeles. And I am 16 time zones behind you. So I am delivering this in the middle of the night. But I've had plenty of coffee, so don't worry. I think I'll be awake for the whole presentation. If you'd like to learn some more about my work, that you see my website is listed there, trainingeducationmanagement.com. So today, what I would like to do is address a number of key issues I think that we confront as we try to move into more of an online virtual instruction mode, mainly due to COVID, although some of these trends have existed prior. So the first thing I want to address with you is how are webinars and classrooms different? There's been a tendency to just think, well, I can just take all my classroom content and courses and I'll just start delivering them over the internet and I'll be good. Well, it turns out that the two media are quite different and therefore we need some different strategies. So I'll deal with that first. Secondly, I'll talk a little bit about the instructional design side of webinars and how we create plans that will allow webinars to be effective. Then thirdly, I'll talk a little bit about how we enable engagement and interaction and try to encourage it. I think those of us that have tried online learning know that sometimes the interaction and engagement suffers. And so we'll talk about some of the techniques and the tools we could use. I will also describe the benefits of creating online communities to go with training and educational delivery. Then I will finally talk a little bit about the different technologies that are available. And although I'm not in a position to recommend any one technology to you, I will at least talk about some of the criteria that you should consider if you're in the market to purchase some kind of software tool to allow webinars. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about how we can learn from experience and improve our efforts. So let me start with this first topic of the webinar versus the classroom. As I mentioned, we have tended, at least in what I've seen very often here in the US and North America, is in the scramble to to move into a webinar and a virtual classroom mode. Sometimes we've just assumed that we can just take whatever we did in the classroom and duplicate it. It turns out we really can't do that, and the reasons you see listed here. Webinars are remote. I'm over here in North America, you're over there in Asia or wherever you might be, or the Middle East or anywhere in the world. And because of that remoteness, we lack the personal touch and that we would normally get in a classroom environment where you walk in and you introduce yourself and you get to know people. Unfortunately, webinars don't always allow for that. And even when we do introduce ourselves, we're still not in person. And there's so it's just not the same. And in fact, some experts have described webinars as a cool environment versus classrooms being a warm environment. And by that, we're not talking temperature, but whether we're talking about the level of social engagement that people feel. When you're in a classroom sitting with your peers, you're much more likely to become engaged and to be more conscious of the people around you. In a webinar, you're sitting by yourself in front of a computer, and even if you wave to the camera, it's just not the same. It's a more passive, cool environment. And that presents a lot of challenges to us, obviously, in trying to engage people in learning. Now, on the other hand, webinars are global, as opposed to classrooms, which are very, very much local. One of the great advantages of a webinar is that people from all over the world can come together and can learn together and share information together in a way that we never really could when we were tied to a physical classroom. Just as an example, if you were doing a physical live ARTDO International Conference this year, chances are I wouldn't be participating because of the cost and the time required for me to travel around the world to come to you. But with this webinar, obviously none of us have to go anywhere. So that's a great advantage. But it also presents a challenge because we don't always know who our participants are. We don't always understand the context and the culture from which they come. So that presents its own challenges. And then finally, I would say that the delivery of learning in a webinar is a bit different than in a classroom as well. In classrooms, largely due to tradition and the fact we've had education for hundreds of years, we tend to expect the instructor to lead the instruction and to organize and to provide all of the guidance required in a classroom setting. When we get into a webinar, we're finding out that the role of the instructor changes more to be a facilitated learner. And that facilitated learning it often involves a lot more effort on the part of the participant. I don't know if you've had this experience, but many people have told me as students that actually online learning is harder. And I think what they mean is it's harder because you have to be more self-directed. There's less of an opportunity to rely on the instructor and more required of the participant. So we see instructors acting more as facilitators of the learning. So given these differences, I think it's a big mistake to just simply take the same course designed exactly the same way that you used to teach in a classroom environment and assume it's going to work in a webinar. It often does not work. So let's talk a little bit about what kind of instructional design planning then we should be doing. One thing I would argue is you should really create a separate plan for your webinar. Now, it may be based on the existing course, but it still needs to accommodate the differences. One of the things that often is missing is clear expectation for course completion. So what exactly does the student need to do to successfully complete the course? And setting all those expectations up front, I think, is extremely important. Many times students enter an online learning environment without any clear idea of what it's going to take on their part to successfully complete it. The other thing that obviously we run into is maximizing participants' attention. Very often attention tends to suffer. And one of the reasons it suffers is because there's a tendency to go into lengthy lectures, to have talking heads, to have one-way communication. And of course, after a while, that kind of gets dull and boring and people lose interest. And then finally, I'm going to talk about how to leverage the technology that's available so that you're taking advantage of the tools and the features that are going to most likely promote learning. So an instructional design plan, as you can see in the illustration, I think should contain 5 key things. First, obviously, is the content based on the learning objectives and the outcomes you're trying to achieve. Then there has to be a clear plan around how that content's going to be gathered, organized, sequenced, as well as how you're going to develop activities and exercises that engage the audience. Then there needs to be a design that engages learners and makes it easy for them to navigate and learn. There has to be a technology platform that's easy for people to use, that's relatively low cost, but at the same time that it offers features that allow you to maximize learning. And then finally, we need to come up with delivery models that are often blended, where we're taking elements of a classroom, elements of online learning, elements of self-study, and we're figuring out ways to blend them together to get the best benefits of all those. Okay, so let me just share one example from a course that I teach here in the US. And you see that the instructional design plan in this case includes a very detailed script. It includes the slides that are going to be appearing on the screen. It includes notes for the facilitator, detailed notes as to what they should be doing and saying. And in this case, it also features a producer role, which is someone who basically handles all the technical issues. Make sure that participants can access the course and can access all its functionality, and monitors chat, and otherwise provides support to the facilitator so they can just focus on the facilitator focusing just on the content and delivering it. Now, for those of you who are not fortunate enough to have a producer, if you have to do both roles, then it's even, in my view, even more important to work out the details of the course so that the person doing both of those tasks can, in fact, do them successfully. Okay, so with that, I'm going to stop here for a second. And at this point, I'd just like to invite any questions that any of you might have, or any comments on what I have shared so far. Do you also find that webinars are a different experience than a live classroom? And if so, how different do you think they might be? And any questions you might have? So, for example, we had several people weigh in on whether they thought online training can be as effective. Some of you said yes, some of you said maybe not as effective. And I think a lot of that depends on the tools we're using and the way in which we design the learning so that people get more out of it. I noticed Dio also mentioned that his biggest challenge is connectivity issues, or hers, yeah. And indeed, the technology becomes a barrier at times, I would agree. One of the things we can't control is the connection of each of the participants in the program. I mean, we as instructors can ensure that our connection is good, but we never know about our audience, right? And that can be a big issue. And of course, Safura also noted that the time differences are a challenge. You know, we're working in a global environment, so you can jump on a webinar any time of the day, but that also means we have to accommodate many, many different time zones, right? And then there also, I see Professor Lingages has mentioned that webinars for class teaching different from webinars for professionals. And yeah, I would agree, and I'll talk about that a bit later in the technology. It's one thing to take an online degree program where you're engaged in a program over many months or even years. Versus taking a 2-hour webinar on some topic of interest to a professional. Obviously, the approach that you would take, the care that you would take in designing those would be quite different based on the length, right? And Trina also mentioned giving feedback to participants. And I would agree, that's another challenge. I'll talk about some ways we can do that. But normally in a regular classroom, the instructor also builds personal relationships, right, with the student. And after a while, you almost feel like you know them. They're part of who you are, and they become familiar with you as well. So all of that kind of personal socialization that we normally expect. After all, we humans are social creatures, and so the fact that that socialization is not available often in a webinar does provide challenges. So great, I appreciate that. Do we have any other questions?
Dr. Ford, there are two questions. What is your definition for webinars? How is it different from virtual classroom by Mr.
Right. Yeah, so I part of our struggle, and Jacob, thanks for that question. I think part of the struggle is we're still trying to define our terms, right? This is also new to us. So, I hear these terms thrown around and sometimes used interchangeably. Um, I would say a virtual classroom and a webinar could potentially be the same. But typically, we think of webinars as being shorter sessions, right, of an hour, couple hours, maybe half a day. And virtual classrooms could be, of course, much, much longer. Those could comprise courses lasting a semester or a year, such as in college. The other term I'm hearing here in North America is virtual instructor-led training, or VILT. So there's a VILT. So there's a new acronym for you. I don't know if that has caught on in your part of the world or if you have another way of describing it. But yeah, I think part of our challenge is just to define our terms here. Yeah, and to ensure that we're all talking about the same thing. But in this case today, what I'm talking about, I think applies to both short webinars as well as longer online education. And do we have another question?
Yes, by Ms. Dennis Tan. If you do not, could you see, Dr. Ford?
Oh, yes, I can see now, yeah. So if you don't have a producer, then which do you focus more on? Well, you have to focus on the facilitation, I think, Denise, because, I mean, obviously that's the heart of the training. But the problem is very often, even if you know the technology fairly well, it's hard to do both at the same time. It's just hard to multitask. And so as much as possible, I would encourage you to try to get somebody to play a producer or a host role, much like Irene is doing for me today, right? And if that's not available, then yeah, you have to focus on the facilitation. It seems to me that's the critical piece, right? The good news is as you use these tools more and more, they become more familiar and it becomes easier, right? All right, well, those are some great questions. Let me now go back and I'm going to share a little bit more information with you. All right, and so now let's talk about the all-important subject of engagement and interaction. So how do we get people engaged in a remote webinar type of world, virtual learning type of world? How do we promote interaction? So a couple of guidelines. First, obviously, using a variety of instructional methods. So don't rely just on a couple, especially don't overuse lecture. Instead, think about other ways that you can get people to react and respond. One of the things that I would encourage is certainly look at the unique tools available with whatever software platform you're using. And we'll talk about that here towards the end. But obviously some of the tools are better than others, and each has their own features and functions. But it's important to explore and learn what those tools are so you can then employ them. I've seen people using some very sophisticated online learning tools and using 10% of the capability. So they're kind of they've lost the opportunity to get more out of the tool they're using. Think about providing both individual and group interaction. So you can have individual activities that you ask people to do, short things where they're reading something or they're responding to a question or they're reflecting or they're doing other kinds of individual activity. And then you can also encourage small group activity as well. I think it's also very important to keep the groups down to a fairly small size. If you get 50 to 100 people in a webinar, then there's no way you're going to have a whole lot of interaction. Ideally, I like to see online learning limited to about 20 people. I have done sessions for as many as 30 or 40 at a time, but when you get to even that large a number, it's very difficult to personalize the instruction. And that really, I think, should be the goal. Can we make the online world feel as personal as a classroom? That's a struggle, but I think that should be at least a goal. All right, so I'm going to show you several examples of engagement that I have used, and I'm going to illustrate these with a popular online training tool called WebEx. It's made by Cisco Corporation here in California, and at least here in North America, it's quite popular for online webinars and online education. So one of the features it has is called polling. And just like I conducted a very brief poll with you at the beginning here, this polling function is a little more sophisticated. As you can see over here on the right-hand side, it allows you to create multiple choice kinds of poll questions. It also allows you to create quizzes. Where you could pose quizzes to an audience to see what they remember, say, from a previous session. It allows you to do both multiple choice and short answer type questions. It allows you to mark the correct answer, as you see here in number 2. It allows you to record individual responses if you want to keep track of how individuals, let's say, are doing on a quiz. And finally, it will automatically display the results to the audience when you're done. So you open a poll, people have a couple of minutes to respond, and then it will automatically graph the responses and give everyone an idea what people are thinking. And you'll see here, this is the instructional design plan. In this case, using a poll as a review feature for a previous session. So this is a multi-session course, and the beginning of each new session, there's a quick review. There's some poll questions that are asked, either true, false, or multiple choice, and then there are instructions from the producer on how to do those. So polling is one way to produce interactivity. Another example is the whiteboard. Now, those of us who are familiar with classroom training will recognize the whiteboard is really taken directly, literally off the wall of the classroom. So again, WebEx has a whiteboard feature where you as the facilitator can open a whiteboard, and then the board allows people to type information. So you could encourage people to answer questions or share information just by typing on the screen, and each person gets their own color, so it's color coded. I know who typed what. It also has some fairly simple drawing tools. You can draw shapes, and you can also do freehand drawing. So for example, I've used this to play the game of Pictionary, if you remember that game from your childhood, where you have to illustrate a word without saying the word out loud or even saying anything. You just have to try to illustrate it. So I've done a Pictionary game with participants where they have to illustrate some concept or some term that we're learning about. Okay, and the other nice thing about the whiteboard is you can also then save this, and it can become part of the notes for the class. So if you've debriefed an exercise or a case study, or if participants have added their thoughts, you've got that already captured and you can save it. So that's the whiteboard. And then the last interactive feature I wanted to talk about are breakout sessions. So some of the more sophisticated learning tools these days allow you to create small group sessions. They call them breakout sessions in WebEx. And the breakout session allows you then to create a much more interactive environment. Each small group essentially goes into their own little version of the software, and they can then talk among themselves. And in WebEx, you can either have breakout sessions that are automatically created, or you can create manual sessions where you assign the participants. You decide who works with who. You can set how many sessions, you can set how many people can be in each session. And once you do that, essentially what happens is then the attendees are dispersed into however many breakout sessions that you decided to create, and then they can chat among themselves. So let's say you have 5 groups of 4 people each in a 20 person class. So those 4 people sitting in that group, they are now free to chat, talk with each other, share information, etc. So you assign them some work to do, and they go off and do it. And then as the instructor, you can also then drop in on each breakout session, and you can participate and make comments, or you can simply be the fly on the wall and sit there and enjoy it and listen in, right? So an example that I used is in one of the courses we teach some of the common data collection techniques used in needs assessment. And so in this case, we created breakout sessions. So each group was assigned one data collection technique. They read some information about that technique, and then they were asked to prepare a brief summary, which they put on a whiteboard. And then when they came back out of their breakout session, a spokesperson for each group presented that information. So I find I love the breakout sessions. They really allow for a lot more interaction than we would normally get. Okay, so before I go on, let me just stop once again, and I'm going to ask you, what are you currently doing to promote interaction and engagement? For those of you that are doing some online learning, what techniques have you found that you can use? Okay, got a couple of questions here. The WebEx meeting, yeah, so Chikin, you're right. There are actually 2 versions of WebEx. There's the meeting version, which is used primarily just for corporate meetings, doesn't have these tools. There's now a WebEx training or WebEx educational version that includes all these extra features. So if you're looking into WebEx, yeah, look for the training version, I believe it's called. And then Sapta is wondering about what's the criteria for having breakout sessions. So the way I think about it is anytime in a classroom that you wanted to break up a group of people and give them an assignment to work on as a small group, so any of those assignments could serve as good breakout sessions. The one thing that I would urge you is to be sure that the instructions, the directions, are very clear and that they're all taken care of up front. Once people get into the breakout session, sometimes it gets a little chaotic, especially if you have many of them. So just make sure you've given them very clear directions, and ideally pointing them to some kind of a participant guide or other reading material that will guide them. Okay? And others are saying that you also use breakout rooms and polls. Sephora mentioned that. Trina mentioned using whiteboards, using gamification. Good. Yeah, there are a lot of programs like Kahoot, Mentimeter. There are quite a few out there now where you can create interactive games, right? And then you can have people do those. And then, of course, having offline activities as well. I agree. Providing, well, we hate to say it, but homework, if you will, right? In other words, giving people things to do between sessions, especially when it's a multi-session course, right? Asking questions ahead of time, et cetera, et cetera. And then somebody wants to know, what do you do to get people engaged if there's 500 of them? Well, so far this AirMeet tool looks pretty good to me as a conference tool, but yeah, we can maybe talk about some of the others. So good. I see a lot of people definitely trying to make your sessions more interactive. I think we all realize that that's the missing piece in many webinars. You know, most of them are just a talking head, just, you know, talking at you for hours at a time. And of course, after a while, we kind of lose interest in that, right? So, okay, excellent. I appreciate that. Let me then go back to a little bit more on some of the other things that we can do. So the next topic I want to address is online communities. I think part of the problem with the webinar, as we've identified, is that lack of social connection, that lack of interaction and connection with others that are taking the course. In a normal classroom, you walk in, you get to know your classmates, you learn more about them, you share information, you create study groups, you know, you share tips and techniques, etc. So we don't have that in the webinar. But what you can do is try to create a supportive online learning community that exists around the webinar. And in that way, using both synchronous and asynchronous features of the webinar. So by synchronous features, I mean when we are all together, as we are now, you know, in a virtual classroom, there are certain things we want to be doing. Primarily conveying new knowledge and giving people opportunity to work with it. But the asynchronous features, what do people do between class sessions, is also extremely important. So I would recommend using pre and post session assignments to deepen the learning. Pre-assignment might be including gaining basic knowledge about a subject before you go into it in more depth. Post-session assignments should be aimed mainly at application. How do I take what I've just learned and apply it in some useful, meaningful way? And ideally, ultimately, what we see happen sometimes is that communities of practice grow out of a course. And I think a great example of that is the Certified Training Professional Program, the CTP program, that some of you may have participated in. The program's been going on now for quite a few years, and over the years, graduates have come to know each other, continue to stay in touch, and have become a kind of community of practice. So that's something that you may want to consider also emphasizing. I think it provides a much richer learning experience and ultimately greater impact. So one of the simplest examples of online community is having a discussion board. Those of you that have been involved in online education, you're probably aware that generally online educational programs include some kind of a discussion board. So in this case, we have a multi-week course that's being offered. And before each class, there are questions that are posed in the discussion section. You see those questions posed here. Oops, sorry, I got to go backwards. You'll see questions posed here by the instructor in gray, and then the participants are invited to respond. And here's a response in white from one of the participants, and that response can be seen by everybody, so everybody's sharing. But at the same time, the instructor can also come back and provide individual feedback based on what they saw their learners present. So in this case, the instructor has responded to this person and given them some encouragement. So the discussion board is a great way to share information among the class. It's also a great way for the instructor to provide feedback, either to the whole group or to individuals based on what they've written. And in that way, each participant feels, I think, like they're getting a little more individual attention. Okay, so I'm going to come back to the embracing technology here in a moment, and we'll talk about some of the tools out there. For now, let me now just check in with you, and maybe if you would like, if some of you would like to share, what experiences do you have in trying to create online communities, and what challenges have you run into, if any, in creating online communities around your courses? So let's see, do we have any comments? I don't see any so far, but again, feel free to share your own experiences with the rest of us. In my experience, one of the problems with the discussion board or any other extra activities that you may build in outside the webinar is getting people to actually do them. Obviously, the challenge is, I can post a question, but can I make people answer it, right? So I would say build in some incentives, point out to them the benefits that they can get out of participating in the discussion. And in some cases, if you're actually grading people or you have to pass them in a course, you make it a requirement. Many online education programs require participants to actually post something every single week. If you don't participate, you don't pass the course. So it depends. You can provide incentives, or you can provide some requirements that people actually do it. Otherwise, unfortunately, sometimes you'll see very few people participating in a discussion, and of course, in that case, it's not going to benefit people, right, in the same way. Okay, so now let me go back, and I do want to talk a little bit about the tools that are out there and some of the pluses and minuses. And if I've left your favorite tool off the list, I apologize. I'm not getting paid by any of these people. I'm not in a position to benefit in any way. But I will say this, that we really need, if we're going to do this well, we need to embrace the technology, and we need to become very proficient in using the tools that we've chosen. So I've illustrated for you here 7 of the most commonly used online learning tools here in North America. Now, in your part of the world, it may be different. I know from what I understand, many of you are using Zoom. Zoom has become extremely popular here in the US as well. Although it works better for meetings, I would say, than for instruction and for courses. Zoom has some limited features. You can certainly share your screen, for example, and you can have multiple people engaged and participating, but it also lacks quite a few of the specialized tools you might expect in an educational software. So let me turn first to Blackboard. Blackboard is a tool that's been around quite a while. It's used pretty widely in university educational programs because not only can it deliver training, but it has a pretty robust learning management system built in and record keeping and that kind of thing. So if you're in a formal educational environment where you have to track student attendance, you have to track proficiency on tests and other assessments. Blackboard has a lot of those features. Great record keeping and also great testing feature. So if your course includes an exam, Blackboard can handle that easily. Likewise, Google Classroom has caught on here in North America since COVID has struck. Most of our schools are currently closed or have at most very, very limited attendance. So most students from all the way from kindergarten up through college are learning through the online version, and Google Classroom has become quite popular. They have added a lot of things to their Google Meeting software to make it more of an educational program, and it also has fairly robust record keeping. So again, for those of you that are teaching in a formal situation where you have to keep records of your participants' progress, Google Classroom has a lot of features. And the other nice thing for those of us that probably already know, Google provides a huge amount of support and resources and technical support. So it's become kind of a favorite there. So I would say Blackboard and Google Classroom would be good choices in formal educational settings. So now let's talk about the corporate world. In the US, Cisco's WebEx is probably the most popular, but another tool made by Adobe is called Adobe Connect, and it too has all the same features as WebEx, and some would argue is even more features. I would say it's probably a little more difficult to learn it. Although both tools, the more features you have, the more there is to learn. So that does present something of a challenge. But with Cisco WebEx, as one participant pointed out, just make sure you're not just getting the meeting version, because that has a limited set of tools. You want the WebEx training or educational version, right? And then another one that's become very popular is Microsoft Teams down here at the bottom. And again, Teams was originally created as a virtual meeting tool. It's widely used by people that have the Microsoft Office 365 suite. It interfaces nicely with all the other Microsoft products. And what Microsoft's done is, like WebEx, they have now come out with an educational version of Teams that adds many of the features that we would like to use in a webinar setting. So I would say Adobe Connect, Cisco WebEx, and the new Microsoft Teams educational version, those are probably the top three choices for corporate online training. And then, we do have GoToMeeting, which is a tool primarily for virtual meetings. It has very limited options for virtual webinars. So it's kind of in the same category as Zoom. It's pretty easy to use, but it's going to have limited number of tools and limited capability in terms of, full functional education. So those are the 7 that are most popular here. And so my question to you now is, which of these tools are you using, or are you using something I haven't even mentioned? So I would invite several of you to share which of the platforms are you most commonly using. I know Zoom is one that is being used, but what other ones? So Teams is becoming popular. Yeah, both Trina and Dio mentioned that. Yeah, if you're a Microsoft house, if your company is a Microsoft user, then Teams fits in pretty nicely, and it has some seamless interfaces with the rest of Microsoft's products. So that could be helpful. Anybody using something I haven't mentioned? I don't know. There's probably dozens of other products out there, and my guess is we're going to see even more coming onto the market. Originally, I think these software companies, they saw virtual meetings as being a big business for them, right? So many of these tools started just as virtual meeting tools. But now that we're in this COVID situation, and who knows for how long we're going to be in this situation, I think now suddenly companies are realizing, wait, there's this enormous, multi-billion-dollar industry out there called corporate training, and they need tools too. So I think we're going to see more and more of these companies start to invest and put money behind some of these tools. So, okay, well, I think I'm almost running out of time here. Well, it's funny how time flies when you're having this much fun, right? But let me just conclude with a thought from Mr. John Dewey, who is often described as the father of American education. And he noted, we don't just learn from experience, we actually learn from reflecting on experience. And so I think one of the challenges that we have is to start evaluating the effectiveness of webinars and do it in a little bit more scientific way. Yes, seek feedback from stakeholders, especially participants, but also I think we need to look more carefully and more scientifically at the application of new skills. Are people actually learning through the webinars? And if so, are they actually applying what they're learning? And if so, is their performance actually getting better? I think those are things that we are obliged to start to measure and look at, and that's how we're going to get better at this. And honestly, all of us, I think, need to push the frontiers of virtual learning. I have a feeling, here's my prediction. Yes, we will eventually get over COVID, and yes, eventually we'll all get together again. But I have a feeling that virtual learning is here to stay, and that we're going to see more and more blended learning types of environments where we're using both in-person learning and we're using virtual online learning, and we're trying to get the best of both of those types of learning and produce hopefully something even better. So I would definitely encourage you to continue to push the frontiers and realize we're really on the cusp of something very new, and there's a lot more work ahead of us. So with that, I want to thank you very much in all those different languages. And if you have additional comments or questions or would like to learn more about my work, you'll see my email listed there for you, donaldjford@verizon.net. And so at this point, I am now going to stop and see if we have any final questions from our audience. Got about 4 minutes to go, I guess, right? Yeah, so how do you make participants focus on the webinar? Wu is asking. Yeah, I mean, it's hard. Again, this is where you, the instructor, don't control the room, right? If you were in a live class and you saw somebody sleeping in the front row, you'd go wake them up, right? You'd tell them, hey, pay attention. Unfortunately, in this virtual world, people can be sleeping on their desk and we don't know it, right? And so I think that what we have to do is get people involved and engaged. So they have to focus if you're asking them a question or they're in a breakout session or they're answering a poll. That's when they have to focus. So the more we can make it interactive, the more they have to focus. Okay, anything else then before I... and what about the AirMeet? So Wu is asking. Well, this is my first encounter with AirMeet, so to be honest, I'm learning it as well as you. I think this is a pretty nifty tool, especially for a virtual conference. It's the first software I've seen that is specifically devoted to conferences. and tries to create a virtual conference, right, where you're participating much as you would in a live one. So I've been impressed so far. As a learning tool, there are some things they could add and improve in the next version, but I'm sure they're aware of that. Thank you. So I guess with that, let me turn it back to my host and moderator. And I do want to thank both Dr. Atif and Irene for your excellent support. And I thank all of you, of course, for attending today. And I wish you all the best as we go forward. We're pioneers in this new experiment of virtual learning, and I hope you take it with that kind of spirit. Be a pioneer and blaze a trail for the rest of us to follow, okay? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Danford. Really highly appreciate it, and really we benefit a lot from what you give us, and we hope for more all the time with you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you.